Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the new Director of the Government Affairs Office for PPIC, and I want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento, my home. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we'd like to thank them for their making this event possible. Additionally, we'd like to thank the PPIC Donor Circle for their support for this important research. For today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher Dean Bonner, who will present the findings from our latest PPIC statewide survey of Californians and their government. And we'd like to thank again the James Irvine Foundation. For the first time in a long time, California's presidential primary may have a significant impact on national politics. Maybe not in delegate count, but certainly in the tone and ideas that we're hearing. We're seeing active campaigns, particularly on the Democrat side of the ticket. In my neighborhood, particularly in my neighborhood, there's a ton of signs. This is my unscientific research, which indicates to me there's a lot of interest, and certainly a lot of neighbors talking about it. This is not only good for political consultants who really love a good fight and want to put their kids through a private college, apparently, but also it's good for voters because the candidates are actively seeking their vote. I suspect we'll be debating the impact of the 2016 presidential debate for a long time to come. In addition to the presidential candidates and the impacts on that contest, there are some very important down-ticket races and initiatives that we've touched on in the poll today. You should have received a handout when you checked in with some of the key findings. The full report is now online, and the presentation slides are available for your use in the future. We also have, we're doing our crosstabs online now, which is something a lot of polls don't do. So for you who really want to geek out, it's an exciting way to look at, and we know who you are. It's a great time to look at the details of the poll. A few more things as we begin. Next Friday, June 3rd, we'll be back here for a discussion on technology infrastructure at the public schools, featuring a presentation on a new PPIC report, followed by a panel discussion. Learn more about that and sign up to attend on the PPIC website. Later today, you will receive a short survey via email, and we ask that you please take a moment to fill it out. Your opinion does matter to us. And finally, please turn off your cell phones. And now on to the presentation. Dean Bonner is an Associate Survey Director at PPIC who has expertise in public opinion and survey research, political attitudes and participation, and voter behavior. After the presentation, we'll open up to question Q&A. Now I turn it over to Dean.
As she said, kind of political attitudes and whatnot is my kind of my focus of my work, and so this time of the year is especially interesting. To follow up on two things she said, our crosstabs are available online among all adults and likely voters, as well as our time trends for all the questions that we asked in this survey, and so that's something new that we recently started. So if you haven't looked at it, make sure to go ahead and check that out. And the other thing would be the evaluation that you will receive later today. It's very important for us as a survey team to evaluate not only the presentations that we do, but all across PPIC. So when you receive that, please take the time. Appreciate it. Right, so this survey, we looked at election and national issues as well as state and fiscal issues. But before getting into the details, just to talk a little bit about the PPIC statewide survey, our goals are to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions of Californians. We interview all Californians, not just registered voters or likely voters, so all Californians are available to be in our survey. And we seek to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion on these issues. Since 1998, we've provided a voice for all Californians, 320,000 and counting, in over 150 general issue and regional surveys. So this particular survey was funded by the James Irvine Foundation, and the two sections, one on election national issues, looking at the preferences in the presidential and U.S. Senate races, both in the June primary and in the November election, as well as approval ratings of federal elected officials and political party favorability. At the state level, with the release of the budget, we focused on state and fiscal issues, looked at the overall ratings, the approval ratings of elected officials, as well as the overall mood. We looked at state budget, including some things about raising revenue, as well as marijuana legalization. Our survey took place from May 13th to May 22nd, and so we came out of the field just the day before the registration deadline for the June primary. We interviewed 50% on cell phone and 50% on landline, interviewed a total of 1,700 adults with a margin of error of 3.3%, just under 1,000 likely voters with a margin of error of 4.3%. We had just over 500 Democratic primary likely voters with a margin of error of 5.7%. And the margin of error for the just shy of 300 Republican primary likely voters is just north of 7%. So that's something to keep in mind as we're discussing some of these findings today. So today we see that there are stark partisan differences when it comes to the satisfaction with the candidates in the presidential election, with just over half of Democrats satisfied and about 1 in 3 Republicans and independents satisfied. We see that satisfaction among both Democrats and Republicans has dropped since our March survey. And in fact, satisfaction among Republicans has dropped each month since we began asking this question in December of 2015. And as I mentioned, satisfaction among Democrats and Republicans has dropped double digits just since March. Supporters of Hillary Clinton are 20 points more likely than supporters of Bernie Sanders to be satisfied with the choices. That number in March was about 68% to 61% satisfied. So satisfaction was much higher in March among both Clinton and Sanders supporters. And low-income voters are much more likely than more affluent voters to be satisfied, and men are more satisfied than women when it comes to the choices of candidates in the presidential election. So turning to the presidential race, and a topic which has gotten a lot of attention today, in our survey of 500 and change Democratic primary likely voters, we find that the race now is 46% for Hillary Clinton, 44% for Bernie Sanders. Keep in mind the 5.7% margin of error. The race among just registered Democrats is 49% for Clinton and 41% for Sanders. The sample size for independents that chose to take a Democratic presidential ballot is too small for separate analysis. As we found in March, there's a huge divide when it comes to the younger people versus older people, with 2 in 3 younger folks under the age of 44 supporting Bernie Sanders, and about 6 in 10 above age 45 supporting Hillary Clinton. In March, just to note, the race in March was at 48% Clinton, 41% Sanders. And as I said, that was about a 6% margin of error in March as well. Sanders has the support of likely voters who describe themselves as very liberal by about 20 points, while half of voters who describe themselves as somewhat liberal or middle of the road support Hillary Clinton. So the ideological divide there, as you might expect, is persistent. On the Republican side, with the Republican nomination for president essentially decided, and I guess today that's kind of news is broke that it's kind of almost officially decided. We decided to ask if people would vote for Donald Trump or would vote for someone else. And so what we found today is that most Republican primary likely voters say they would vote for Donald Trump. 1 in 4 say they would vote for someone else, and 6% are undecided. While Trump is the clear choice across regions and demographic groups, men are 10 points more likely than women to say that they would vote for Trump. Also, likely voters who describe themselves as very conservative are 20 points more likely than those who are somewhat conservative to support Trump. And so looking ahead to the November matchups, potential November matchups, we decided that asking these now would be with the Republican race essentially decided, kind of gave us opportunity to see how the two Democrats would match up against Donald Trump. And we found that Donald Trump trails both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders by double digits. The race between Clinton and Trump is at 49% Clinton, 39% Trump, while the race between Sanders is 53 to 36. Overwhelming majorities of partisan likely voters support their own candidates, and independents favor both Democrats by a wide margin. There are some notable differences that emerge. Sanders outperforms Clinton among independents and among young voters. And 85% of Clinton supporters say that they would support Bernie Sanders, and 75% of Sanders supporters say that they would support Clinton in the November matchup. And so those are some interesting findings regarding what happens, if either one is the nominee moving forward. But this is common at this point in time that there is at least somewhat, little bit of unification that will need to happen as the race continues into November. So we also ask about the U.S. Senate race and the primary contest to fill Barbara Boxer's open seat. We find that 6 in 10 likely voters are satisfied with their choices, with Democrats much more likely than Republicans to be satisfied. Just over half of independents are satisfied. Latinos are far more likely than whites to be satisfied, most of that driven by the party split. And when we look at the Senate race, we find that as it enters its final stage, it's important to note that under California's top 2 primary system, the primary race is open to all candidates regardless of party, and is open to all registered voters. At this point in the campaign, Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez would be the top 2 candidates and would advance to the November general election. Fewer than 1 in 10 likely voters support Republican Tom Del Beccaro, Ron Unz, or Duff Sandheim. Results today are very similar to our March survey, so there hasn't really been a lot of movement in this race. Among Democrats, Harris has the support of 43% compared to 32% who support Sanchez. And nearly half of Republicans and 1 in 3 independents are unsure of how they will vote, with Del Beccaro receiving the most support among Republicans and Harris the most support among independents. Latinos support Sanchez over Harris by a 2-to-1 margin, while whites prefer Harris over Sanchez. In a potential November matchup, Harris leads Sanchez at this point by 8 points, and Harris leads among Democrats and among independents, while half of Republicans say that they would not vote in the primary. Latinos support Sanchez by a wide margin, and whites are divided between Harris and saying that they would not vote. So going back to this finding that half of Republicans say that they would not vote in the Senate race in November, that's a big number, especially if you consider what may happen down the ticket further than that. And so granted, it is still May, and that's a far ways off, but the concept of having 2 Democrats for a statewide election in November, half of Republicans are not very enthusiastic about that. So turning to the approval of federal elected officials, President Obama's approval continues to hover around 60%, as it has since January 2015. His approval had hovered around 50% during the latter half of 2013 and all of 2014. There's a wide partisan divide on President Obama's job performance, with about 8 in 10 Democrats approving of his job performance and 8 in 10 Republicans disapproving. Independents are more likely to approve than disapprove of the president. When it comes to Congress, just 3 in 10 approve of its job performance today, and fewer than 1 in 4 have approved since 2009. There's a partisan divide on approval of Congress, with about 1 in 5 Democrats. There's partisan agreement on approval of Congress, with about 1 in 5 Democrats, Independents, and Republicans approving. So disapproval is at least something that partisans can agree on. And it's good that Congress can bring people together across parties. So compared to adults nationwide in recent surveys, Californians in our survey are more approving of both the president and of Congress. So immigration and what should happen to undocumented immigrants currently living in America has been a topic of discussion during the presidential election thus far. Californians, as they have in the past, have consistently illustrated over the years, in a response to a variety of different questions about this issue, that they think undocumented immigrants currently in the country should be allowed to stay if certain requirements are met. There's a bipartisan agreement on this as well. And looking beyond party, it's widely held belief with 3 in 4 or more across regions and demographic groups thinking that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay if certain requirements are met. So there's partisan agreement on the kind of overall issue of what should happen to immigrants. However, when we turn to a policy position or offering from presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump, who has promised to build a wall among the entire U.S.-Mexico border if elected presidents, we find strong majorities of Californians and likely voters oppose of this idea. Just 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 3 likely voters are in favor. Majorities across regions and demographic groups oppose, as do overwhelming majorities of Democrats and Independents. However, a majority of Republicans are in favor. And when we look at Republican likely voters who say they would vote for Donald Trump, 78% of those folks are in favor of building the wall. And so that at least shows a link between his electoral stance and this policy position. So with the Supreme Court being in the news in recent years, or at least over the last year, with some pretty landmark decisions when it comes to, say, same-sex marriage or the Affordable Care Act, we wanted to come back to this issue of how Californians feel about the Supreme Court more generally. And Californians are divided on whether or not they approve or disapprove of the court. Approval was slightly higher in 2005, with 52% approving shortly after Justice O'Connor announced her retirement. Partisans are divided on this issue, with Democrats more approving than Republicans. Nationwide, a February CBS News poll shortly after the death of Justice Scalia found that 49% of adults nationwide approved of the Supreme Court. And of course, another reason that we may want to ask about the Supreme Court would be this idea of filling the seat of Justice Scalia. And Californians at this time, we find that half of Californians say that the Senate should confirm Merrick Garland, while 1 in 4 say they should not confirm him, and another 1 in 4 have not heard enough to have an opinion or are undecided. As one might expect, there was a wide partisan divide on this issue, with 7 in 10 Democrats supporting confirmation and 2 in 3 Republicans against confirmation. Californians offer roughly similar opinions to those of Americans nationwide in a March Pew Research Center poll. It's important to note that this question is about whether or not Judge Garland should be confirmed and not about whether or not hearings should be held. And so we kind of went back and forth on what exactly we wanted to kind of ask. And so this question is similar to some questions we've asked in the past, and it could also potentially be used moving forward, and had a nice national comparison from Pew, which is always nice to put Californians in perspective. So with somewhat contentious battles within both parties, how do Californians feel about the two major political parties? Half of Californians and 4 in 10 likely voters have a favorable opinion of the Democratic Party, while about 1 in 4 view the Republican Party favorably. Since we last asked this question in December, opinion of Republican Party, opinion of the Democratic Party is virtually unchanged, while opinions of the Republican Party has declined 7 points among adults and 10 points among likely voters. Especially noteworthy is the decline among Republicans in the favorable opinions of their own party, which dropped from 74% in December to 38% today. Democrats' opinions of their own party are pretty much unchanged. And so this finding shows that the nomination process has at least had some impact on Californians' view of the party more generally. This is something that we'll come back to again in the fall, most likely, and I would be willing to guess that there'll probably be at least some recovery there. In the past, I think the lowest point before this month was in the mid-50s, and so it's not common for the Republicans to have this low of an opinion of their own party. So we'll see what happens in the fall. So moving on to the state issues, Californians continue to have a positive opinion of Governor Jerry Brown. The governor has enjoyed majority approval in each survey dating back to April 2014. So that's 16 straight surveys where he's had majority approval. He has the approval of majorities of Democrats and independents, while the majority of Republicans disapprove. At least half of residents across the regions of the state approve of the California state legislature. And approval of the state legislature continues to hover around 40% or higher, as it has since April 2014. While half of Democrats approve of the state legislature, it's interesting that more Republicans approve of Governor Brown than approve of the state legislature. When we take both approval of the governor and the legislature together, we find that 35% of Californians approve of both the legislature and the governor, and 22% disapprove of both. So looking more broadly at how people feel about the state, we see that half of Californians say that the state is heading in the right direction and expect good economic times. At least 4 in 10 Californians have said that the state is headed in the right direction and expected good economic times since December 2012. And finding in recent months illustrate a marked recovery from the depths of the recession when fewer than 1 in 4 were optimistic from 2008 through 2010. And so we went through a pretty big ravine when it comes to kind of just the overall mood of the state. Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to be optimistic on both of these overall mood measures. And in fact, since January 2008, fewer than 4 in 10 Republicans have been optimistic. We find that optimism on both of these measures declines with rising age. And when we take both of these questions together, we again find that about 35% say that things are headed in the right direction and expect good economic times. and 27% of Californians are pessimistic on both of these measures. So there seems to be a core third of people that are pretty optimistic, whether it be about their government or or the overall mood. Those, in general, Democrats are happier about kind of the status quo, while Republicans appear to be a little more unhappy about kind of the mood of the state. So with the state budget situation on a little bit more stable footing than it has been in years, thanks to a recovering economy, we find that Californians are taking notice. Today we find 44% of Californians say that the state budget situation is a big problem. This is kind of in rare space. This is the third consecutive month that we found the budget being viewed as a big problem, and that's the first time that that's happened since I think 2008. So Californians are optimistic about the state budget situation. However, half of likely voters call the state budget situation a big problem. And so the likely voters are a little more pessimistic about the budget situation. 3 in 4 Republicans call the budget situation a big problem, while fewer than half of independents and Democrats hold this view. And at least 6 in 10 Republicans have said that the state budget situation is a big problem since January 2008. And so they've held a steady opinion that the budget situation is a big problem throughout kind of the ups and downs of the budget situation and the economy. So with the governor's May revise, he's continued to be very cautious about the state of the budget situation, choosing to really temper the willingness to spend and to build up the reserve. And so we've asked a question periodically about what Californians think should happen to the budget surplus, and Californians are divided on this issue. With 50% saying that we should pay down debt and 45% saying restore social service funding. Democrats prefer to restore social service funding, and an overwhelming share of Republicans would prefer to pay down debt. I know that's newsworthy and shocking to everyone. Likely voters prefer paying down debt and building up the reserve by a pretty good margin. So the difference between all adults and likely voters here is very interesting, especially when it comes to kind of some of the tax measures that we'll have on the ballot in November, but more about that later. And so women are much more likely than men to support restoring social service funding, and this preference declines sharply with income. So the higher household income, the less likely you are to want to restore some of the social service funding. So as I mentioned, the governor recently released his May revise on May 13th, and we asked about his overall plan, which included increased spending, funds to pay down state debt and build up reserves, and a proposal to raise revenues for transportation infrastructure projects. When respondents were read a description which excluded the transportation proposal, solid majorities of adults and likely voters are in favor. Strong majorities of Democrats and independents are in favor, while Republicans are divided on his plan. Support for the governor's plan is widespread, with at least 6 in 10 across regions and demographic groups in favor. Now, when we introduced the concept that the plan also includes a new fee on vehicles and an increase in the state gasoline tax, you see that support plummets to 35% among all adults, and only among Democrats across parties is there still majority saying that they favor the governor's budget plan. We find that 8 in 10 Democrats with knowledge that of the infrastructure funding plan now oppose it, compared to being divided at 45% each when we look at the original plan. And so majorities across demographic groups disapprove of the plan with the transportation funding, as do majorities across regions, except in the San Francisco Bay Area where they're evenly divided. And so while the governor's budget plan proposes funding surface transportation projects through a new vehicle fee and increased or stabilized gasoline taxes, others have put forth the idea of a state bond or having localities pass local taxes. When it comes to a state bond measure, 6 in 10 Californians, including just over half of likely voters, would vote yes. The vote threshold needed on that would be half, and so 52% of likely voters that would pass at the state level. Support for a local sales tax falls well short of the required 2/3 among all adults and likely voters. Support for both methods of paying for transportation funding among Democrats is higher among Democrats, followed by independents and Republicans. And majorities across regions would vote yes on a state bond, while support for a local tax does not exceed 50% in any region. So as I mentioned, the way that people feel about the state budget situation will potentially impact some of the initiatives that we have on the ballot. One of the more prominent ones is this idea of extending the Proposition 30 income tax increases to fund health care. And what we find is that about 2 in 3 adults and just about 6 in 10 likely voters say they favor this idea. Keep in mind, this is not the ballot language. This is not what voters will see. This is not what we will likely end up asking about in the fall. This is just kind of a general snapshot of the idea of Proposition 30. Once the ballot label and summary come out, we will be using that in any further polling that we do. We asked about this idea of the increase to fund healthcare because that's one of the measures which are now kind of before the legislature, having reached the 25% threshold of signatures needed. And this measure, as I said, would extend the tax increase for 12 years on higher income earners to fund education and healthcare. We find about 6 in 10 Californians and likely voters would be in favor, but wide partisan divide. There's widespread support for this measure, with the majority of Californians across regions and demographic groups in favor. In past surveys, we asked similar questions that kind of got at the idea of Proposition 30. Some of them also included the state sales tax increase, which was originally part of Prop 30. And support tended to be slightly lower in those months. And that's pretty much fully due to the fact that this increasing the state sales tax is not a very popular idea among Californians or likely voters. And so when you just limit it to a tax on higher income earners, support definitely does increase. So another tax proposal that is aiming for the November ballot is the idea of increasing by $1 the tax on the purchase of a pack of cigarettes. That would also include kind of a equivalent tax on other products. Strong majorities of adults and likely voters are in favor with bipartisan agreement. However, Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to be in favor. In our January survey, when we were asking about kind of the importance of some of these ideas that could be on the ballot, we found that 53% of adults said that raising the cigarette tax to fund health care was very important to them, was important to them. Across regions and demographic groups today, we find that at least 6 in 10 favor increasing the cigarette tax. Now, if you've attended some of these briefings before, you'll know that we've asked a similar question just about cigarette tax. We've asked questions about alcohol taxes, the so-called sin taxes. And in general, Californians are supportive of the idea of taxing someone else. So whether that be someone else that makes more money than me, someone else that smokes, those support for those taxes tend to be higher. So what's looking to be a crowded November ballot, if you believe some of the stories, potentially 18 ballot measures on the November ballot, so start studying, is the idea of legalizing marijuana for recreational use. The last attempt to legalize marijuana was in November 2010 with Proposition 19, and that narrowly failed. We find today that support for legalizing marijuana, just in general, just asking a general question about should the use of marijuana be legal or not legal, we find a record high 55% of adults and 60% of likely voters say that it should be legal. Most Democrats and independents support legalization while Republicans are opposed. Across age groups, 2 in 3 Californians under 35 favor legalization, while Californians age 35 or older are closely divided. And so that's an area where we've actually seen movement in recent years among the 55 and older crowd, which used to be more likely to oppose it, but now it's really divided on both the 35 to 54 and 55 and older. Strong majorities of African Americans and whites are in favor, while fewer Asians and Latinos are. An overwhelming majority of those who say they have tried marijuana favor legalization, while a solid majority of those who have never tried it are opposed. So not too surprising. So if this initiative passes, it is estimated that legalized marijuana would generate about $1 billion annually in tax revenues at the state and local level, with most of it directed towards substance abuse prevention and treatment programs. More than 7 in 10 adults and likely voters consider this fact to be, or this concept to be important. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to view this as very important. And when you look at those who think it should be legal or those who think it should not be legal, the importance, especially the perception that it's very important, is basically the same across those two groups, which is interesting. So kind of to wrap up, there are striking partisan differences when it comes to the satisfaction of candidate choices in the presidential and Senate primaries. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are in a really tight race in the Democratic presidential primary. And looking forward to November, Donald Trump trails both of those by double digits. Democrats Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez lead the top 2 U.S. Senate primary, and with nearly 1 in 3 in that race undecided, including that 46% of Republicans. So while they're the top 2 now, we'll have to see what happens as we get closer. So half of Californians today favor the Democratic Party, while 1 in 4 view the Republican Party favorably. Important there is to note that favorability among Republicans of their own party really dropped from 74% to 38% today. And fewer than half see the state budget situation as a big problem, but there is a persistent partisan division. As I mentioned, more than 6 in 10 Republicans since January 2008 have called the budget situation a big problem. And Californians and likely voters looking forward to November favor extending the Proposition 30 income tax increases, increasing the cigarette tax, and legalizing marijuana. And so I'll go ahead and open it up for questions now. If we could just make sure that before you ask the question, since this is being recorded, that one of the lovely ladies with the microphone could be by your side so that everyone, including the camera, can hear the question. Thank you.
Question on the Republican Party, the Republicans' view of their own party.
Yes.
You showed it collapsed, basically. Is there any other states or national polls that same type of trend is happening? Have you seen?
I've looked at the overall numbers. I haven't looked closely at the Republican Party findings of their own party. Some of that, not everyone is as generous as we are to provide all of the crosstabs for all of the questions. And so sometimes gathering that type of information is difficult. And given our compressed schedule, I haven't looked at that yet, but that's definitely interesting, and I'll definitely consider that. Yeah. One second. Sorry.
Thank you. I have a question about income demographics. So I'm wondering, in terms of outlook of the state, if there's any variability, or if you know, if poorer Californians are more optimistic or less optimistic, if there's a significant difference there.
If I'm not mistaken, and I will verify my thoughts there, there is a kind of a weird pattern there with people who make under 40,000 being more likely, slightly more likely than those who say make above 80,000 to say that they expect good times. And so it's those who make the less that feel like good times are coming. And perhaps the uncertainty at the national level could lead some of the people who maybe make more money to say that good times may not be ahead. And so, yeah, but it is kind of a little bit counterintuitive. But I think that's what we found in prior surveys as well. Anyone else? Oh, yes.
Jeff,
Hi.
question is, I think for the first time in more than a decade, for the federal government level, politics-wise, that we seem to be able to have an impact, i.e. Clinton and Bernie choice. Have you ever done any surveys in the past, or is this the first time that you might consider something of where indeed politics as leading the nation, that we may have an impact on the federal level?
That's a good question. I mean, generally speaking, our primaries have been in June. However, if you think back to 2008, it was moved forward to February in hopes. And kind of my recollection of that is that it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't like the race was over, but I think given kind of the dynamics of the race, even having it moved up to February, it didn't seem as though, there was as much attention. Because obviously you move it up and you matter more, so to speak, but it's also less of a tense time, because now it's like everyone's paying attention because it's still kind of going on. And so in February of 2008, it was early, but you weren't really sure where the race was necessarily going to go because there was so much left after that happened. And so, but it is something that, as a political junkie like me, I'm very happy that we can have a say and that people are paying attention to what we have to say. Yes. Oops. Yes.
Thank you. With regard to the Proposition 30, do you have any information on geographically Northern California versus Southern California, where the lines were drawn with regards to your results?
Yes, let's take a look. And so looking at this, it's a support across the regions, with it being slightly higher in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, which is, kind of, on a lot of these things, you can kind of parse out the Bay Area and Los Angeles and then kind of parse out the rest of the state. There are some differences that kind of are counterintuitive sometimes, but on some of these big tax issues, given the kind of the Democratic stronghold versus the Republican stronghold in other areas, that's pretty consistent.
So you didn't see anything with regard to the density of population in the South versus the North?
I haven't looked at anything down to that level of analysis yet. Yeah, we actually, this survey, so that we could get it out in a timely fashion, given the kind of the newsworthiness of it, we had a really compressed schedule, and so the last 3 days have been a little bit of a blur. So, yes, thank you. Alrighty, guys. Well, I really appreciate everyone's attendance today. If you have anything else, don't hesitate to come up.